Hello, and welcome to the Daily Rings of Power podcast, your daily dose of the latest news, rumours, and speculation about the Lord of the Rings, the Rings of Power. The day is Sunday, September 18th, and I'm your host, Harry. I hope you're having a wonderful morning, afternoon, or evening, wherever you are in the world. We return this weekend for our spoiler review of Episode 4 of the Rings of Power, The Great Wave. As we've done for previous episodes, this won't be an in-depth, scene-by-scene breakdown. Rather, I'll cover the overarching story arcs, talk about my favourite elements, and also discuss some interesting details I picked up on. However, just like last week, I will be releasing a longer and more in-depth breakdown of Episode 4 next week, where I'll be joined by Anna, my LSR, to help me analyse what we saw, discuss our favourite moments, and speculate on what might be coming in Episode 5. As you all know by now, we have to start the episode with a reading from the Professor's work. Today's reading comes from the Silmarillion, Chapter 24, of the Voyage of Eärendil and the War of Wrath. Then at the bidding of the Valar, Eonwe went to the shore of Aman, where the companions of Eärendil still remained, awaiting tidings. And he took a boat, and the 3 mariners were set therein, and the Valar drove them away into the east with a great wind. But they took Vingilot, and hallowed it, and bore it away through Valinor, to the uttermost rim of the world. And there it passed through the door of night, and was lifted up even into the oceans of heaven. Now fair and marvellous was that vessel made, and it was filled with a wavering flame, pure and bright. And Eärendil the mariner sat at the helm, glistening with dust of elven gems, and the Silmaril was bound upon his brow. Far he journeyed in that ship, even into the starless voids, but most often was he seen at morning or at evening, glimmering in sunrise or sunset, as he came back to Valinor, from voyages beyond the confines of the world. I thought it very fitting that we would begin today's episode with a passage about the fate of Eärendil, given the long shadow he cast over this episode's storylines. Now, as I said, we won't go scene by scene. We'll cover the main storylines, beginning with Númenor, before heading on to the Southlands, and finally wrap up with Elrond's ongoing interactions with the dwarves in Khazad-dûm. Let's dive in. The opening scene to this episode might be one of the most powerful openings to any episode of TV I've watched in recent years. The way Miriel's interactions with the new mothers of Númenor lulled us into a false sense of calmness and security, only to be rapidly torn apart by the distant rumbling of the island and culminating in the apocalyptic destruction of Númenor. Now, readers of the Silmarillion will instantly recognise the significance Miriel's vision has, but even for show-only watchers, that sense of potential doom hanging over the heads of Númenor's rulers is so important for the show to establish early on. The fact that the island kingdom is at a crucial fork in the road in its history is key to the Second Age story. I also have to praise the director and cinematographer for the way in which they framed Miriel and Galadriel experiencing the vision. As I demonstrated on Twitter, the choice to use identical camera angles for both sequences really nailed the idea that the Palantir is showing you a vision that you as an individual do not have control over. The way in which each character responds to these visions is the important distinction, not their own autonomy in perceiving the vision. Speaking of Galadriel and Miriel's interactions, I loved that their initial showdown in the throne room did not involve either backing down. Galadriel, as we have seen previously, is ironclad in her convictions and is not willing to waver in her self-belief, while Miriel is not going to be swayed by words alone, especially when it comes to her approach in leading Númenor and its people. In a similar vein, the fact that Galadriel escalates the situation by trying to seek an audience with Miriel's father, Tar Palantir, is a sign of how desperate she is to build an alliance to fight the growing threat in Middle-earth. While Miriel is understandably defiant to Galadriel's request, it is also another smart way that the show is demonstrating the shaky political ground upon which Miriel's rule is based. This is something we see later reflected in Pharazôn's interactions with the elf-hating mob in the city square. I'll dive more into the implications of that scene on next week's in-depth breakdown. However, on rewatch of that scene, doesn't it seem like Pharazôn may have orchestrated the whole spectacle? From the drinks he brings out after finishing his speech, to the way he clasps the arm of the initial instigator of the protest, someone is clearly playing political chess for their own game. On a law note, while Elendil's little joke in the royal court mainly served to try and lighten the tension, it was also a smart way to lay background detail for the world. Elendil's reference to himself being a petty lord gives viewers the knowledge that while not a member of the royal family, his own house is one of minor nobility. I suspect in future seasons we'll explore the role his father's position as a lord comes into conflict with the direction of Númenor. It's also worth noting Miriel's reference to the idea of a runic emperor. Within Middle-earth, the land of Rhûn lies to the east of Mordor, and is populated by men whose interactions with Sauron in future will be of great importance. I'm deeply hopeful that this little mention means we will explore Sauron's attempts to dominate the men of the East in future seasons of the show. We also know that there will be another allusion to Rhûn later in the season, as the white-robed cultists, or mystics as they might be known, are apparently travelling from Rhûn, according to an earlier interview with one of the show's producers. Galadriel and Miriel's interactions in the tower with the Palantir are particularly fascinating to me, not just for the vision itself, but for their discussion about faith. Miriel says, "Faith may bind one heart, Galadriel, but it is too fine a thread from which to hang a kingdom." For me, this line beautifully summarizes the divide at the heart of Númenor. The kingdom may have been born out of their allegiance to the elves and the Valar, and its existence is in fact a gift from the gods of the world, but that time is now gone. Something the show is already laying the groundwork for is the fact that the men of Middle-earth's faith in the divine powers is always a less solid fact than the elves. The mortal races do not interact with the Valar, nor can they visit Valinor to prove their faith true. Over time, this strain on the faith of men is what creates the schism at the heart of their culture. And Miriel recognizes that. She knows that while she may still have faith, it does not have the same hold over all her people. While the end of the episode suggests that Miriel will still ultimately be driven by this faith, the fact her force heading to Middle-earth is in part made up of volunteers demonstrates how tenuous her position is. No doubt once she heads to Middle-earth to fight, we can expect to see Pharazôn exploit this vacuum of power and offer an approach to the people based on tangible strength and power, rather than faith and fealty to the Valar. As a brief side note, we also got more fantastic lore Easter eggs in the Palantir's room. We see what I suspect are many heirlooms of Númenor's founding king, Elros, the brother of Elrond. We see a sword that many have suspected could be Narsil, given its similarity to the design used in the Peter Jackson film. However, it could equally be the sword Aranruth, which belonged to the First Age Elven king, Thingol. Similarly, we see an axe which is likely a reference to Dram Borleg, the Axe of Tuor, a shield with a wing insignia, again a reference to the House of the Wing, which was Tuor's house in Gondolin. In concept art released for the show, you can also more clearly see a bow, which once again is a reference to the bow of Bregor, a lord of men in the First Age. All of these items are noted in unfinished tales as having been brought to Númenor by Elros himself. There's also a tapestry behind Galadriel seeming to depict Beren and Luthien, with the former holding a Silmaril, as well as yet another helm on a pedestal, which could be the dragon helm of Dolomin, which is an item we've already seen depicted several times in the series. I raise all these not just to name drop cool items from the Silmarillion, but also to highlight the fantastic attention to detail that the production design is putting into the Rings of Power. They didn't have to include these, but they add an extra layer of detail and immersion, which, frankly, delights Tolkien fanatics such as myself. Now, I know I haven't touched on Halbrand's suspicious whisperings. The Sauron allegations are getting stronger and stronger. Nor have I touched on Isildur's awkward exit from the Sea Guard, or the interactions of Eärien and Pharazôn's son, Kemen. We just don't have time to get into each of these today, but I'll make sure to discuss these in depth on Wednesday's episode. In the interest of time, we do need to move on to the Southlands. After the big tease at the end of last week's episode, we finally got to meet our mysterious villain in the Southlands, Adar. And what an introduction it was, from the tender aspect of his final moments with the orc, to his cryptic exchange with Arondir, and his overall visual design which blended the beautiful and ethereal of elves with the sallow and deformed horror of the orcs. Joseph Maul really knocked this scene out of the park in my opinion. His line delivery, which came out almost as a whisper, sent chills down my spine, and the way his eyes seemed to constantly be watering was incredibly unnerving. Briefly returning to his very first scene with the wounded orc, I love that we got to see a deeper layer to evil. While there's no need to overly humanize orcs, it's important to consider the origin of orcs, and perhaps Adar, as elves which were once tortured and corrupted by Morgoth. The fact that they have this sense of culture and kinship is something I was delighted to see. As for his dialogue with Arondir, this was absolutely fascinating to me. We had all but complete confirmation that Adar is a First Age elf who once lived in Beleriand, the westernmost part of Middle-earth, which was destroyed and sunk below the ocean at the end of the War of Wrath. We also got a brief glimpse into his motives and ambitions, as he talked about the need to untangle the lies of the world, and his desire to create a new world, something that would require the power of godhood. Whilst I'm not exactly sure what his plan is, this idea brought me back to some of Tolkien's key ideas about how darkness manipulates. It's an idea we hear echoed in the Akallabeth by Sauron, when he's attempting to corrupt men by telling them that his master Morgoth is the true god and that only he can create new worlds for his faithful servants. I have to admit, I'm still a little unsure whether Adar is working for Sauron or is a pretender to the throne of Morgoth's successor, but it seems he has his sights set on Theo's shadowy sword hilt. All I know is I immediately found myself wanting more from Joseph Maul. And my fingers are crossed the show doesn't skimp on screen time for his character in the second half of the season. Now, I know some of you will want me to speculate on what existing Tolkien character Adar could be, but honestly, I am pretty firmly in the camp of thinking he's an original character that is perhaps drawing inspiration from Tolkien's First Age characters, such as Eöl, Maeglin, and maybe even Maglor. However, as I talked about way back on the second ever episode of this podcast, the fact that his armour matches the design of both Gil-galad and Galadriel's own attire is very telling. You see the wave pattern on his breastplate that we see on both Gil-galad and Elrond's costumes, whilst the stars adorned on his mail shirt clearly evoke the imagery of Galadriel's own armour that we saw her wear in the Forodwaith in episode 1. All of this points us towards Adar being an elf from the First Age, likely taken and corrupted by Morgoth or Sauron. Given his armour, we could speculate he is one of the Noldor, but honestly, I'd be surprised if the show gives us that level of backstory for him. If you want to hear some of my thoughts I had and speculations we dived into about Adar before the season started, go back to listen to episode 2 of this podcast. Meanwhile, in the Southlands, Theo's misadventure in the village and escape from the orcs was, in my view, one of the best choreographed sequences in the show so far. Right from the moment the sun hid behind the clouds, through his encounter with the orc in the inn, and his escape through the woods with Arondir, the scenes nailed that perfect blend of excitement and fear. The sequence of Theo's escape from the well and through the village reminded me, as I'm sure it did for a lot of people, of one of those intricately built video game levels where you have to use stealth to escape a dangerous situation. The near-miss moments of Theo narrowly avoiding the orcs behind buildings or in the tall grass were timed like an intricate dance, naturally building the tension to his brief capture. And while I'm sure there were some hidden cuts in there, that one-shot feeling of the camera following him really is a mark of fantastic cinematography. I also cannot heap enough praise on the scene of Arondir, Theo and later Bronwyn fleeing through the woods. The music and slow-motion camera work reminded me of Boromir's last stand in the Fellowship of the Ring, and I have to admit I was scared for Arondir's longevity at several points in that scene. This was an example where the show used slow motion well, and it really added to the tension and the feeling of Arondir's superior fighting skills coming into play. Not to mention the fact we finally saw an elf on screen run out of arrows. But most of all, that ending scene as they burst forth from the woods into the breaking light of dawn was just such an excellent choice from the director and cinematographer. Not only is it artfully framed, but it gives us that stark visual representation of the battle between the darkness and the light, a theme which the show has reinforced across multiple episodes now. Back at the Watchtower, I also found it fascinating that we got a couple more hints at the future of the Southlands. When Bronwyn asks where the latest refugees have come from, she states that this means people have fled from every village from here to Orodruin. Now that we've had the show confirm in the previous episode that the Southlands are the area of the map which will become Mordor, it's nice to have that reminder of the key landmark which will play a role in that transformation. I'm expecting to see some volcanic activity before this season's end. I also greatly enjoyed the scene between Theo and Waldreg, where we had confirmation that it was the latter's barn in which Theo found the mysterious broken blade. Not only did this dialogue set up the future potential for men to side with darkness and with Sauron, I loved that Waldreg referred to Sauron as a beautiful servant. Given that we should see Sauron in his fairer forms either later this season or next, it's great for the show to set up the idea that Sauron does not only rule through fear in the Second Age, he manipulates and deceives others through a beautiful and tempting visage. Fingers crossed that Theo isn't already past the point at which he can still find the light. Now, I know some people have raised the mention of the Starfall as evidence in favour of the Stranger being Sauron. However, I think that's a bit of clever misdirection, and a reminder that people can misinterpret signs and portents to their own perceptions. Waldreg may think this is a sign of Sauron's return, but it equally may be a sign of the Valar sending one of their own Maiar to combat Sauron's return. But I guess we'll have to wait and see where the Stranger plays into this. Finally, we were treated this week with a return to Elrond and the Dwarves. Robert Aramayo, Owain Arthur, and Sophia Nomvetti continue to be absolute stars of the show for me with their performances. And according to a poll I ran on Twitter yesterday, this is reflected by the general audience, who chose this storyline as their favourite so far in Season 1 by a whopping majority of 52%. It's clear to me that the show is onto a winner with their dynamic, and bodes well for future seasons, given that we know Elrond and Durin will be sticking around for some time. This week, we got the long-suspected confirmation that the dwarves' discovery of Mithril will be a catalyst and driving force for their story in the show. No doubt the first seeds of their people delving too greedily and too deep have been laid in this episode, with Prince Durin's desire to better his people's future having disastrous consequences down the line. It was also quite chilling and surprising for myself as a book reader to see Elrond swear an oath, the consequences of breaking such an oath seeming to be incredibly dire for him. Obviously, we have the disastrous history in the Silmarillion of the Oath of Feanor, which led to so much tragedy. But I do like that Elrond's oath was one in devotion to friendship, rather than in pursuit of some goal or desire to possess an object. All the same, I think we'll see in the very next episode that this oath and his desire to stay loyal to Durin will bring him into conflict with both Gil-galad and Celebrimbor, not to mention the fact that we know Mithril is used in both the creation of the Rings of Power and in the Doors of Durin, both of which I expect we'll start to see later this season and next. However, What really made this storyline for me was the role of fathers and sons. Elrond's brief monologue about his own father, later followed by the exchange between Prince Durin and his father the king, were both beautiful moments for me. I've long said that something I want the show to explore is Elrond's isolation in the world during the Second Age. The absence of his parents plays a huge role in that, as does the immense shadow of their legacy. Getting a scene of Elrond talking about Eärendil's deeds and his elevation to being a literal celestial object was one thing, but Robert Aramayo's delivery of Elrond's self-doubt regarding his father's views was just fantastic. I want more of Elrond considering his place in the world, thinking about his relation to his brother Elros who is gone, as well as his parents. It's just such an interesting dynamic for me, and I hope we get more of it both in this season and in later seasons. Why not have another scene where Elrond is looking up at the stars and talking to someone else about his father once again? There's no such thing as too much when it comes to this dynamic, in my opinion. Once again, this scene also played a dual role in that it was able to remind the audience of the key theme of mortality and loss. Elrond has a somewhat unique perspective here, given his own immortality versus the loss of his parents and brother, but the fact he relates that to Durin as a reminder of not wasting precious time with loved ones was not only moving, but something I'm sure we can all relate to. The later conversation between the two Durins was equally wonderful. I think many had suspected that there would be a rather cold, adversarial relationship between father and son here, but I was surprised at how tender this exchange was. Not only did the show attempt an explanation for its slight change to the idea of resurrection in the line of Durin, more importantly from my perspective, it used that to establish a key emotional beat. The fact that the king reminded his son that he was always there for him, whilst acknowledging that their anger and stubbornness is something that both unites and divides them. I think it's so important that this show plays into the idea that there are good fathers in this world, and that their relationships with their sons may be complicated, but it is a key positive emotional driver for many characters in The Lord of the Rings. It also added a layer of complexity to the Prince Durin, showing us that while he values his friendship with Elrond, that does not make it a blind trust. I'm intrigued to see what comes next for their dynamic, and expect that whatever happens in Lindon, it is not going to be all smiles and celebration of this new alliance. Distrust and deception may be on the horizon. Finally, you know I could not finish this episode without talking about my favourite character, who we got the slightest of scenes with in the last episode. Celebrimbor. I have to say, it was amazing to see the construction of his tower come together, and as I noted on Twitter, the presence of a grand staircase being featured at the base of the building got me very excited. Readers who remember the Unfinished Tales will know Celebrimbor is going to have a pivotal moment take place on those very steps later down the line. What's more, the design of the tower was beautiful, the scaffolding almost evoking the stairs around the trees in Lothlorien we see in Fellowship of the Ring, and the unique design of the cranes which seem to reflect a Fibonacci spiral, giving way to the idea of Celebrimbor being someone driven by a love of art and aesthetics, but also mathematical design and engineering. Eagle-eyed viewers will spot in the background of his scene with Elrond, Celebrimbor has model versions of these cranes sitting in his study. It's just one of those small details I adore. However, what most interested me about this scene was how anxious Celebrimbor seemed throughout. When we add that to his slightly odd urgency regarding having the tower and forge completed by spring, this only adds fuel to the fire for the theory that Sauron as Anatar has already been in Eregion. Perhaps this is a red herring, or I could be reading too much into his aspect in this scene, but I do like the idea that Celebrimbor is already being preyed upon by the Lord of Gifts. Now I will say I wish we were given more screen time with Celebrimbor, and as I'll discuss with Anna on our breakdown, I do think the show is making a mistake here in sidelining his character. I was prompted to think about this with discussions with other smart people on Tolkien Twitter this weekend. While I understand the importance of establishing characters like Elrond and Durin, it's important the audience gets invested in Celebrimbor's story sooner rather than later, and I do hope the second half of the season gives us more of the famous Elven Smith, so that by the time we reach his climactic moments, the audience cares and feels the emotional journey that we're meant to go on. Now, as I said throughout, I know I didn't cover everything in this episode, as it was such a jam-packed 70 minutes of screen time. On my breakdown episode with Anna next week, I'll try to cover what we can discern from Halbrand's suspicious whispering to Galadriel and Pharazôn, where the show might be taking Isildur and Eärion's storyline, as well as what the implications are of the episode's final scene. Hopefully you still enjoyed my exploration of the key storylines and themes we got in this episode. I had a fun time working on the script for this review, as it allowed me to coalesce some of my rambling thoughts in one place. Do come back next week then, if you'd like to hear myself and Anna engage in some fun analysis and speculation, as well as get into some of our criticisms for this episode, even if they may be small and nitpicky to an extent. Also, please let me know on Twitter what questions you have about this episode, or topics you'd like me to dive into on that breakdown. I'm happy to dive deeper into the questions of lore, character, or where certain storylines may be going. Feel free to leave them in the comments of this episode, and I'll also be posting a request for questions just before we record our breakdown episode later this week. But for today, that's all we have time for. As always, I'd greatly appreciate if you could leave a rating or review on whichever podcast platform you use. And if you haven't already, make sure you subscribe so you never miss an episode. Thank you so much for listening. I'll be back in a few days to talk more about Episode 4 of The Rings of Power, The Great Wave, on the Daily Rings of Power podcast. Namarie.